From the Sky News Centre, this is Paul Murray Live.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you for watching. Big breaking news. 9 o'clock right now in Sydney, Canberra and in Melbourne. But the story tonight is out of South Australia, where right now it is 8:30 on a Monday night. A couple of hours ago, we learnt that what was one of the great concerns out of the High Court decision of releasing so many of those detainees that were being kept in detention because of fears about what might happen in the Australian community, well, sadly, it seems in one of those cases, it seems that it has come to pass. Now, as you know, there were more than 180 people who were let out by the High Court. Now, the High Court decision was made, but the federal government made the decision to release the people from indefinite detention before the written reasons were fully released by the court. Now, again, lawyers like opinions, all the rest of it, there's a million of them, but many people believe that there was no need to release all of those people into the Australian public until the written words from the High Court had come out. And as you know, the High Court had some wiggle room for the government to be able to keep some people behind bars who may well be a threat to the community. It, in part, is why there's some new laws that are being discussed right now. But as we were told over and over again by the hapless Home Affairs Minister, clueless Claire O'Neill, that the security of the Australian public was all that they cared about. Well, one of the things that we all feared the most has now come to fruition. One of the people who was released in that batch of people was not one of the people who was involved in the central case that ultimately got the High Court to rule the way that it did. This was a person who was quite visible to the media in the days after the case. And as we learn this afternoon and now into this evening, there was apparently an incident that took place in South Australia last weekend, and this person is now back in jail. The 65-year-old faced the Adelaide Magistrates Court. I'm reading now from the Adelaide Advertiser and their accounts of what's happened here. I don't want to jeopardise anything that's currently before the courts, so I will simply stick to what has been approved and what has been published this evening in the Adelaide Advertiser. You will see many other media and many other details. I will keep to this. That the 65-year-old has faced the Adelaide Magistrates Court. He's been charged with 2 counts of indecent assault. Just 3 weeks after the High Court decision, that this person has now been released into the community, first via Western Australia. Documents released by the Advertiser now say that the Adelaide Magistrates Court revealed that he'd been living in a hotel on Main North Road in Paruka. South Australian police alleged that he indecently assaulted a woman at that location on Saturday evening. Now remember, this is a person who would not have been on the streets unless the federal government made the decision to empty everyone out of detention after that High Court ruling before they got the wiggle room to potentially keep some of these people, potentially this person, behind bars. The owner of the motel, who did not wish to be named, said that he had checked in on Monday, November 27. He experienced no issues with him until the night of the man's arrest following the alleged assault. He has appeared in court with an interpreter this afternoon in South Australia. He did not apply for bail, thus he is still in custody and he will be there until there is another court hearing which will take place in January of next year. Now, let's all be very clear. This is the scenario that we feared. This is why it was headline news. This is why there has been the concern and why the public reaction to the behaviour of the government to the High Court decision has been as focused as it had. Again, this man became very visible as one of the people who came out of detention. He is now back in jail. Not because of the results of the federal government, but because of what police allege took place last weekend in South Australia. I'll talk about this and a whole lot more with 2GB's Ray Hadley a bit later in the program. And sadly, he, like I, is unsurprised but still amazed that a situation that should well have been avoided has now not been.
They didn't have to release these people. They didn't have to release them. She knew a pedophile was about to release. She knew a murderer was about to release. She knew sex offenders were about to release. She knew drug dealers were about to release. She knew bikers were about to be released. And there was a bit of nervousness attached to it. So would we be surprised if someone's been charged with offences today? No, we wouldn't be.
This story will only get bigger. We will discuss it as the evening rolls on. By this time tomorrow night, there'll be even more detail on the table. But again, I do not want to do anything that jeopardises potential justice for the apparent victim in this situation. It is a disgrace. Now, Claire O'Neill and Andrew Giles told us time and time and time again that while all of this process was playing out, and you know how they were caught flat-footed, despite the fact that after a few days they pretended they'd been planning for this for months, people went out. They went out without visas, without ankle bracelets. They were released into the community before the details that gave them the wiggle room to potentially keep some of these people in was released. Now, they have said this over and over again, and in light of what we have learned about this evening, these words are particularly hollow.
At every turn in the way the government has handled this matter, we have focused on one thing and one thing only, and that is the safety of the Australian community. And there was only one reason for that, because they put politics above the safety of the Australian community.
Well, while clueless Claire O'Neill wants to be all sanctimonious, there is a woman in South Australia who has made a complaint to police, and there is a scenario now where somebody has been charged with indecent assault. The only way that indecent assault may well have been able to take place was because the person whom has now been accused of it, and again, we will find out what their formal plea is, and everyone is assumed to be innocent for the most obvious of reasons, but this situation would not have happened if the government did not release everyone in relation to that High Court decision. Earlier in the day, Peter Dutton, before we even knew this information, said what I'm pretty sure he'll be saying even louder and stronger tomorrow. These ministers have to go.
This is a government that has botched it. They have made our community less safe. They have put people out into the community that should be on a plane out of our country. These are not people who are of good character. We welcome people in their millions to our country because they are people of good character, because in many cases they make great Australians. And we're a wonderful society today because of migration, but we should not allow people to be released into the community who have committed sex offences against children, who are non-citizens offending against Australian citizens. And Minister Giles here and Minister O'Neill are completely out of their depth. And the Prime Minister should sack Andrew Giles and sack Claire O'Neill and put ministers who are competent into those roles to clean this mess up. Because otherwise we're going to see these people committing offences, further offences against Australian citizens.
And those comments were made before we learnt about what we learnt tonight about a person being charged. Now, there is another situation of somebody being charged with drug possession in New South Wales. That is considered by the system to be a minor offence, but well and truly indecent assault is not a minor offence. More of this as we know about it as it all happens. Meantime, the media, of course, got rather excited today because the federal government is about to introduce new legislation to put all of this behind them. But quite obviously, all of this will stay in front of them until, at very least, this bloke in South Australia reappears in a court in January at the very least. Who knows what happens between now and January. The Senate is currently sitting. The expectation is that these new laws will be adopted by the Parliament, but they're kind of Swiss cheese. Now, they're Swiss cheese because the assumption is that preventative detention may well be able to be used, but it can only be used in 3-year increments, and it's not up to the government. Instead, it's up to a judge to decide whether the person remains behind bars. Now, I'm talking generally now about everyone who was released, despite the wiggle words that were there for the government to be able to use that the High Court gave them. Instead, like many people, they read the headline judgment, they released everyone, when they may well have had the opportunity to stop many of those people that are now out and amongst us. So, under the new laws, here's how it's going to work. They're going to use terror-like powers to make sure that they can lock up particularly dangerous people. Now, these are people whom either previously or between now and into the future will be charged, found guilty of a physical or sexual violent crime that got them more than 7 years jail. Now, that's quite important. Because remember, while there are people who can be charged with violent or sexual offences, they don't end up getting sentences of 7 years or longer. Those people would not be covered by this legislation as we read it here this evening. That's what the amendment process is going to be used for, and some of these Swiss cheese holes may well be plugged by the opposition as a result, again, of what we have been talking about in the past few minutes. Now, they would be released, as I say, after 3 years, unless the government doesn't make a decision to keep them there, but is able to go and reapply to a court that this is a person who would end up being a danger to the Australian community. But the judge would have the same discretion as they would in basically any other sentencing procedure, where they may believe that greater monitoring, go back out into the community but wear an ankle bracelet, go back out into the community but report to police every few days, that may be a more appropriate punishment than somebody remaining in some sort of detention for another 3 years. Now, again, they're going to turn around and tell you this is the toughest stuff of all time. The reality is, at this point in time, I can't tell you how many people that are currently on the streets will end up going back into some form of detention, short of being accused of committing crimes since they had been let out of detention. Earlier in the day, Peter Dutton said that at best case scenario here, we're talking about 2, 3 or maybe 4 of 180 people that have been released back into the community, 180 people who were not out in the community for the most obvious of reasons. They were deemed by multiple governments over multiple years to being a threat to the Australian community. Now, desperately, I'm sure that the Canberra Press Gallery would like to change the subject. Let's get back into rehabilitating the government. Let's turn around the polls. Let's play the political narrative. But the reality here is that this thing does not end when the Parliament ends its sitting later this week. Now, most likely, the government and opposition will get together to try to put something like this in place, but there's a few little issues that you would think the opposition's going to point out. Now, if that's the case, then sure, it'll pass the Senate, but then every member of the lower house is going to have to come back to Canberra to vote on it, where presumably there may well end up being more amendments, which means then everyone's got to come back for the Senate. So this ain't over. But meantime, another giant F for Claire O'Neil. Now, Claire O'Neil is essentially the the domestic national security minister, who should be the forward-facing minister as the Minister for Home Affairs. Now, remember, inside her remit is the Australian Federal Police, Border Force, ASIO. Things like terrorism or anti-terrorism legislation is the purview of her ministry. But as we know, she's there to play the politics, to blame Dutton and change the subject, and she has, despite all of the pats on the back from the Labor people, been an appalling performer. It's why we call her Clueless Claire O'Neil. She's executing the talking points, but then the talking points change 6 hours later and she ends up doing exactly the opposite of what she'd said on breakfast television. Well, as you know, despite the fact that she has this national security position, she has said nothing publicly about the hate preachers who have been very obvious in their support for those whom killed Jews on October the 7th. The people who celebrated in the streets of Western Sydney, or the people who, in Western Sydney, mosques and community centres, again, praise the efforts of Hamas, calling for, again, the destruction of the State of Israel, or sometimes just outright saying evil things about Jews. Of course, she said nothing about any of this. Well, last night on the show, my assumption was that when Nazis went marching up the streets of Ballarat, that she would come out today and use her power in charge of ASIO, in charge of the Federal Police, in charge of counter-terrorism, to send a message that this garbage is not acceptable, not on. I repeat what I said last night. The extremism that these people have shown is not acceptable. Any and every charge that can possibly be sent their way, it should be, as it should be when it comes to the hate preachers. Yet, can you believe it? Clueless Claire O'Neil, yet again, silent. Nothing. No tweets, no press releases, nothing. Nothing about hate preachers, nothing about Nazis. And a situation now where, through her decisions, people were let out of immigration detention only to be accused by police after coming out of that detention of committing indecent assault in South Australia. This thing is going to get worse before it gets better, sadly. Now, while the lower house isn't sitting right now, the upper house is. And while question time amongst the Prime Minister and the opposition leader is, again, something only for super political nerds, question time in the Senate is for a particular type of political nerd, which means when it's the only game in town, we have to watch it for you so you don't have to. But as you know, when it comes to cost of living and Australians' attitudes to the situation that they are in right now, it is largely one of the reasons why 50% of Australians feel that they're financially worse off under Labor, because, of course, they said it would get better under Labor. It has not. Cost of living is, of course, why 51% of Australians now believe that Australia is headed in the wrong direction. And we learned today via the consumer website Finder that they've put together a thing called the cost of living pressure gauge. Now, this is from April 2022, when the cost of living pressure was about the mid-60s out of 100. And that was, of course, very high. This was just before the last federal election, when our government promised clearly, when the strain was in the mid-60s, that, quote, a Labor government will lower the cost of everything. That was the promise. They won an election. Their failure to do so is one of the reasons why they're in the hole that they are right now. Well, same organisation, Find It, today has just released a number that is close to 80. We're now in a scenario of extreme, being the extreme cost of living pressures. They have only got worse. Since the then opposition, now government made a promise to make everything cheaper. That is why they are in a world of trouble. But have a look at this, for a disgraceful attempt at feeding the chooks, a desperate attempt from a government with no clue about what they think you will fall for as the government doing something about cost of living. This is ridiculous. It comes from the Agriculture Minister, Labor Senator Murray Watt, in the upper house today. They actually think this is serious.
And that's why today I've called on the big supermarket chains to freeze the price of Christmas hams. The traditional ham, I'm surprised that the opposition don't think that's a good idea. Sneering at the idea of freezing the price of Christmas hams.
Order.
How concerned about cost of living you are. Well, the opposition might be surprised to hear this, but the traditional ham is a staple of any Christmas lunch in Australia. I would have thought you would have known that. It's time for supermarkets to do their part and say one thing we won't put up is the price of a Christmas ham. Guaranteeing a price freeze on ham would allow families to manage their budgets in the weeks leading up to the holiday. And I really would have thought that this is something that the opposition could get behind, but apparently not. It's always politics for them, not caring about the average Australian citizen who's trying to save some money.
How low rent is that? Now, that was a question that the government asked itself today. So it was a policy that they wanted to get out into the media, that in the cost of living crisis right now, where we have now got to a scenario where most Australians are in extreme pressure from cost of living, their suggestion is that it's the supermarkets that are all to blame, and it's the supermarkets who should do something about Christmas ham and Christmas ham only. This is garbage. But of course the reality is that it is this government. Let's engage with their idea about how important it is, the cost of Christmas ham. These are the people who have increased taxes on heavy vehicles that move Christmas hams around the country. There's a tax that will go up every year for the next 3 years. Then, of course, there is their refusal to cut petrol excise when they have a budget surplus to be able to deal with it. If they're serious about Christmas hams and cost of living, they'd get rid of the increased tax, or they would take back the current tax. Instead, they think you are so stupid. They think you are paying no attention to your own life, that the federal government's there to help, because they're not promising to make Christmas hams different. They're calling on the supermarkets to do it, because this is a replay of the politics that worked for them about the former boss of the Reserve Bank, Philip Lowe. Remember when this government did a spectacular job of taking a public servant out into the public square and feeding them to the wolves, only to be replaced by a hand-picked head of the Reserve Bank who put up interest rates anyway because the situation is getting that bad in the country. These people have no idea what they're doing. They think they're playing great politics and smart alecky games about Christmas hams. When, as you've seen, when it comes to the borders, and now you've seen, when it comes to cost of living, they have no idea. Which brings me to the supermarkets conversation. Now, I am no apologist for Coles and Woolworths. I understand what they do, particularly when it comes to farmers, but that's not something that just started yesterday. It's been going on for a long period of time. If you want to, there's lots of other places to shop. But right now we are trying, the federal government I should say, is now trying to pretend that cost of living is all about the profiteering of supermarkets, not about the cost of doing business if you are a supermarket. Now, if you are a supermarket, you have to pay a power bill. That power bill has gone up dramatically since this government came to power. If you are a supermarket, you have to get deliveries that come to you via heavy haulage vehicles by trucks, which is more expensive because of the actions of this government, paying, again, petrol tax that this government refuses to cut. But everyone to help the Labor Party change the subject, there she is, Jackie Lambie, cheering on the idea of a Senate inquiry where the bosses of Coles and Woolies, who, again, I do no favours for, but they'll be treated like the new versions of the Reserve Bank governor or the new versions of Alan Joyce, where all these politicians who are in a position to do something about the things that I've talked about over and over and over and over and over and over and over again, instead will sit, point and scream. The media will, of course, fall for the game, and Jackie Lambie, well, she gets to help to try to change the government, try and change the subject for the government that she desperately wants to keep in power.
We've been ripped off for years from Coles and Woolies. Let's be honest, they're like a bloody cartel, and I think everybody knows that. But I think what I find really shameful to the point this morning is that we've got to run some sort of another inquiry to tell us the same thing when we know very well that if we bulked up the ACCC and give it more powers, we could actually fix this.
You know, she doesn't have a private member's bill to do any of this stuff. She doesn't want to pass a law. She just wants to pass the buck because, as always, Jackie Lambie has to be on the right side of the rageful crowd. It's been very successful for her politically, but it's like, oh, I'm not in a position to do anything here. Well, why not turn around and say I won't support any government legislation until they do things like remove the truckie tax? I won't support any government legislation until they cut petrol tax. That's when we know you're serious, Jackie. Otherwise, you're just drawing attention to yourself, which I know is the full-time gig. Meantime, this time tomorrow, we will know whether interest rates are going to go up for one last time this year. Now, fingers crossed, looks like it won't happen, but you don't want to bet on anyone here. You have to wait and see what happens. First Tuesday of every month, that being tomorrow, the last one for the year. The expectations are that with the slight changes in the monthly inflation numbers and the slight changes in retail sales, that most likely this thing can get put off until maybe February. But remember, interest rates have gone up by the elbow dozen. There's been 13 interest rates since they started coming up post-pandemic, 12 of those under this government. Now, remember, under the last government, it was, the sky's falling in. Well, 12 of them on this government's watch, including after they sacked the Reserve Bank governor. Well, no excuses whatsoever. And, of course, it's important to note that people are noticing federal government spending. Now, the federal government, while it wants to turn around and say that it's not going to do anything to increase inflation by just firing cash cannons around, by having 35% of the budget being handouts to people via welfare, increasing the amount of welfare that those 35% of people get, it creates inflation, let alone the billions of dollars of infrastructure projects that they're locked into as a result of the states. That will increase inflation. Something that the boss of the Australian and New Zealand Bank, the ANZ Bank, had to say, Shane Elliott. Now, he says that government itself is part of the reason why interest rates, even if they don't rise for the next few months, will not be coming down for a few years. The ANZ Chief Executive, Shane Elliott, has warned that Australia must prepare for higher for longer interest rates, with baked-in government spending pressures through at the end of the decade from infrastructure, housing, climate transition set to make inflation sticky. Put simply, government spending now is part of the mix of why interest rates will stay as high as they currently are, the highest they have been in a generation, 12 of them since Albo came to power. This is a bigger concern, is that the real prospect is that interest rates won't be cut over the coming year. You have to stand back, forget next year. Just forget next year, says the boss of the ANZ Bank. Think about the next 5 years. So remember, we're in a scenario right now, as we've shown you many, many times, people on $500,000 needing to find the best part of an extra $11,000 to pay off their homes compared to this time about a year ago or before there was a change of government. If you happen to be someone who's trying to pay off a mortgage over $1 million, then you end up having to find an extra $30,000. And that will be stuck there for another 5 years. So yes, good news that it doesn't keep going up, but if it's still at this level, it's at a very high level for potentially as long as 5 years. Now today, Penny Wong was asked about this very situation, including that somebody on $750,000 loan has to find an extra $21,000, $500,000 loan, $13,500, and $1 million, an extra $30,000. Thank you to my team. I was doing it off the top of my head and they've given me the air support with the stats. Look at that. That's the amount of extra money since this government came to power. And it could well end up be that amount on top of what you were paying for up to the next 5 years, according to the boss of the ANZ Bank. Thank you, team. Penny Wong was asked about this today, again, in this Senate question time. And I tell you what, I paid attention, and this is the garbage they're serving up. Again, most senior person answering questions in the government today. Here's Penny Wong being asked about interest rates.
Should Australians prepare to live with interest rates being higher for longer, as forecast by ANZ CEO Shane Elliott?
So you just heard. Government spending is why interest rates don't go down for most likely the next 5 years. This person's response, sadly, exactly what I said this government will take into the next election about why you should trust them when it comes to economic management, despite the fact that your life has become demonstrably worse.
We are committed to fighting inflation because we do understand the effect that inflation has.
President, on relevance, I mentioned interest rates, not inflation, and the minister is yet to actually use the phrase interest rates.
I'm interested in a proposition that inflation is not relevant to interest rates. That seems to be the point of that seems to be the point of that. That seems to be the point of that point of order, is that somehow a discussion of inflation is not relevant to interest rates. As I recall, this government returned a surplus in 22-23, and I know that is difficult for the coalition to accept because they trumpeted the back in black, got the mugs out, were quite triumphant, but then, of course, didn't actually deliver one. And I know that's very hard for them to accept, President.
Now, remember how they got to a surplus and increased the amount of resources that were being taxed. Plus, on top of that, they were able to, for the first time in history, count the profits of Peter Costello's controlled future fund. That's how they ended up with a surplus. But don't forget, the intergenerational report released by the very same people who put the federal budget together says there will be budget deficits for the next 40 years. So they think because they've got a budget surplus, Australia's going awesome. The only thing that's going awesome are the people that are clipping the ticket. And the people clipping the ticket is the government. The average citizen is hurting. Remember what I said before about the cost of living pressures. 80% of people are now starting to feel the pressure. They will not fall for cheaper Christmas ham stunts or governments that want to give themselves a pat on the back for still having record spending that will feed into inflation and predictions of budget deficits for the next 40 years. Ridiculous. All right, we've got plenty to debate this evening, and it is a No Sooks, No Lefties show. I've got to tell you that. The great Ray Hadley, I've already mentioned he's here, the equally wonderful Caroline Marcus and Steve Price. They join us next. Big show, lots to talk about, including that breaking news. Exactly what we were afraid of, and all those people were let out by the federal government following the High Court. Somebody has now been locked up in South Australia for indecent assault, who probably never should have been released from detention. This is huge. More in a sec. No Sooks, No Lefties is Monday night. It's my present to you from us at Big W. Is that what they used to say? I think so. None other than the great Steve Price, broadcaster and our dear friend here at Sky News, joining us from Melbourne. Caroline Marcus, who's making her own news, joins us as always here at Sky News. So, guys, the breaking news tonight is that one of the people whom probably should never have been let out has been let out and now has been charged, hasn't put in a plea, but has been charged with an indecent assault in South Australia. Steve, this is what everyone was afraid of. This is the whole reason why it has been the story it has been for multiple weeks. The government has, of course, simultaneously tried to pretend to say, oh, we're completely powerless here. High Court then actually releases the wording that says, well, maybe there is some wiggle room here. They then turn around and say community safety has always been the scenario. Well, obviously, there's a woman in South Australia who doesn't think that rings true. What do you think?
Claire O'Neill has to be sacked, and sacked pretty quickly, I would have thought. I mean, you and I have lived through enough ministerial sackings and we remember some shockers, but I don't remember one nearly as bad as this. The vision you played of her in question time last week when we were watching her trying to refuse to answer questions about this issue, when you play it back in the context of what we now learn around these allegations in South Australia, just makes her look even worse. And as you point out, Paul, this is going to get much worse before it gets any better. I mean, obviously the government's hoping and praying that Thursday comes quickly and they can get out of Canberra and they won't have to answer more questions. But the odds are, if you've got 143 now of these people, and you've got now the suggestion that 2 of them might have committed offences since they got out, what's the chances of there more offences being committed? I mean, pretty high, I would have thought.
Well, and also don't forget the legislation that is now being touted by the government. And again, the government is playing messages games here rather than urgency. Now, remember, if they had urgency, the Parliament would have sat on the Friday, but no, everyone got the weekend off. Then we leak the details of all of it to the weekend newspapers. Then rather than introduce the legislation, 10 a.m. Monday morning, that's the first chance they have. Oh, no, we're going to wait off until Tuesday or Wednesday. Why? Because then they can try to create maximum pressure during the negotiations. This is all the games that are being played about a scenario that is urgent because, as we have just seen, every day matters, and while they think the politics of every day matters, but again, remember, even the legislation they're talking about here is that the only scenario under which somebody would end up going back into this sort of detention would be if they had committed a crime and received a sentence of more than 7 years. And that's the key there, isn't it, Caroline? You've been in and out of many a courtroom, as a reporter, of course, to see people who have committed very significant offences, they don't get 7 years. That's exactly. A very high threshold.
It is a very high threshold, and unfortunately, courts tend to give even very serious offenders a slap on the wrist, and even less than a slap on the wrist if they do something like plead guilty early. They get a significant discount. In this case, the details are shocking. We are choosing not to name him, but this is an Afghan refugee, came here as a refugee, committed 3 indecent assaults on women, 2 of them elderly, in a short space of time before being put into jail and then consequently detention because he had nowhere that he could be sent to, apparently. I just want to talk you through some of the offences because they are so shocking. Reportedly, even the judge at the time, a district court judge, said he was a danger to the Australian community. His first victim, he punched repeatedly in the face before having sex with her. She says she's been left permanently changed. She can't trust people again, especially men. Second incident, he attacked a 64-year-old woman in her home, indecently assaulting her and hitting her in the neck with a walking stick. The third incident, indecently assaulted an elderly woman who was on her own, and during that attack, smashed windows and kicked doors. Now, he was released, and a reporter asked him what he had been in detention for. He lied then and gave a vague response about fighting, but those were his convicted offences. Now he's allegedly indecently assaulted a woman at a motel that he was staying at just weeks after being released. And what good are ankle bracelets now, Paul? They did that alleged victim no good. It's too late for her. And how many others are going to be caught up?
Well, this is why it's massive. And again, the assumption that, we can play the games in the Parliament, it all moves on, summer rolls in, set up the wedding tent at the lodge, all the tricks, all the games, right? Not going to work. Not going to work because, as you say, I said 180 before, it's 141. That, of course, question hangs over.
Paul, you've got a situation here where average Australians watching us tonight are going, well, how the hell did these people get released? I mean, I know that High Court decision came out, but they didn't need to let them all out.
100%.
They didn't need to let them all go. There was the one individual that needed to be released, not all of them. And average Australians watching us tonight would also be going, hang on a minute, who's paying this bloke's motel bill? I presume he's not paying to stay in that motel himself. That'd be you and me, the taxpayer, who would be paying for him to stay in that particular motel. This is one of the worst ministerial failures of policy that I've ever seen. I know you're going to talk to Ray about this shortly, but, we lived through, didn't we? We lived through pink bats and cash for clunkers and no carbon tax under my all of that stuff. This government is shaping up as the shortest term government we're ever going to see. They are in massive trouble.
Yeah, I completely agree.
It's not. I know all the focus is on this guy because of the shocking nature of the indecent assault charge. But there's another detainee who's also been released, who's also been charged reoffending for drug possession. But it just goes to show you what the levels of recidivism are like.
Well, absolutely. But also, what's going to be really interesting here is, remember, New South Wales, and I don't know if they've actually changed their legislation. They're in a conversation about changing their legislation around possession. So it'll be interesting to see where that case goes, which is why I put my particular emphasis on what's happening in South Australia. Let's get to the supermarkets and this garbage today. Can we play again the Agriculture Minister? Now, I'm on a promise not to swear. I'm really on a promise not to swear, but I can tell you what, the entire tongue is being bit as hard as I can here with the Agriculture Minister in a cost of living crisis, deciding today was the day to pretend that rather than actually passing anything, rather than changing a tax, rather than reducing a tax, rather than cancelling a tax, oh no, we're going to appeal to the supermarkets about Christmas hams. Now all of this, of course, is a game to make it look just like the Reserve Bank, that it's nothing to do with us, it's all to do with somebody else, and in this case, the devil horns and the moustache twirling goes on your local supermarket.
And that's why today I've called on the big supermarket chains to freeze the price of Christmas hams. The traditional ham, I'm surprised that the opposition don't think that's a good idea. Sneering at the idea of freezing the price of Christmas hams.
Order.
How concerned about cost of living you are. Well, the opposition might be surprised to hear this, but the traditional ham is a staple of any Christmas lunch in Australia. I would have thought you would have known that. It's time for supermarkets to do their part and say one thing we won't put up is the price of a Christmas ham. Guaranteeing a price freeze on ham would allow families to manage their budgets in the weeks leading up to the holiday. And I really would have thought that this is something that the opposition could get behind, but apparently not. It's always politics for them, not caring about the average Australian citizen who's trying to save some money.
Steve, this is as unserious as governments get. This is the garbage that you do in your 10th year in government with no... I mean, literally, how patronising is this crap?
What a fool. And what about the people who don't eat pork? I mean, he hasn't even thought about that. So why are we not freezing the price of prawns or turkeys or Christmas bonbons? I mean,
or tofu
Murray
for the
Watt
Greens.
has just showed himself to be... I mean, idiot. What a fool he is to say that. I mean, seriously, that is just one of the most ridiculous things I've ever heard a minister say. You almost think that he was, joking. If you heard that in isolation, you'd think, oh, well, Murray Watt's having a lend of us. But he then starts lecturing the opposition, oh, you're not in favour of stopping the price of ham going up. That's just crazy stuff.
Well, again, because most of the media is invested in the turnaround narrative of the government over summer, the immediate response needs to be, well, hang on, these are the taxes you can do. This is what you can instead. You're not involved in all of this. That is so patronising, that garbage. I mean, he talks about hams. He's putting on the ham performance in the parliament.
Very good.
Glazed as they get.
Very good, Paul. I mean, don't come to a Jewish person on the price of ham.
Okay, fair enough.
I would have no clue over what that is. But I have to say, look, I did look into the issue about, it seems like it. I looked into the issue of supermarket inflation recently to see if there was a story there. I couldn't find any evidence, even though we can see on the grocery prices trackers that the prices are going up. So they are playing to the public here because people are concerned when they turn up at the supermarket. Sure, the prices are going up, but is there any evidence to suggest that the supermarkets are inflating it beyond rising fuel prices, which they could have a say in rising transport costs and energy costs and all those things that the government could have.
Breaking news to the lefties, right? This is not a co-op. It is a for-profit company, okay? Again, I got nothing from Coles and Woolies, right? I pay as much as everyone else. Mention my name, pay probably twice as much because the Shoppers Union can't stand what we do here. But still, this attempt, Steve, to change the subject that we're going to turn everyone into Alan Joyce, it's not going to work.
What are they going to do about butcher shops? Most people buy their ham from a butcher shop.
Good point.
So the supermarkets are going to freeze the price and they're going to send all the butchers broke because we won't go to the butcher shop to buy the ham. We'll go to Woolies because it's cheaper. I mean, the butchers are going to be happy with that.
I'm with you. Last one here, Caroline. Sydney Morning Herald, surprise, surprise, doing the bidding of the ABC, as is the Turnbull Times this evening, that apparently Jacinta Price was asked more than 50 times to go on the ABC during the Voice debate, but chose not to. Good. She was treated appallingly when she went on.
Well, exactly. Why would she stick her hand up to just become a punching bag, which is all she would be? I mean, she did go on the ABC. They did broadcast her press club speech, and you could see the way some of the journalists treated her during that speech and the kind of questions, the condescending commentary that came afterwards, which she performed exceedingly well, I have to say, some of her responses.
But also the reality is, the tone, I mean, just because you're Channel 2, magical ABC, doesn't mean you get to behave in whatever fashion you want. Sometimes people have the right to say, you know what, no, I'm not playing this game. I'm not going to play Batman and Robin and Joker and all this sort of nonsense. You're not going to hear me out. And instead, you're going to let somebody who abused me go on for 12 minutes and I'm going to turn around and, you'll interrupt me after the first 30 seconds. Thank you, gang. Rather busy tonight. Ray Hadley standing by for us. We'll get to him next here on Paul Murray Live. Now, back to our breaking news. Since the High Court made the decision to release people from immigration detention that didn't need to be released because they weren't the people who took the original cases to court, instead it was the federal government that tried to rush them out the door as fast as possible, the breaking news this evening in the News Corp newspapers is written by Claire Armstrong. That 2 people have since been charged with crimes, including this bloke who has been charged with 2 counts of indecent assault. He's gone in and out of court in South Australia today. We feared this would happen, and Ray Hadley has been leading the charge on the concern of what would happen once these people left detention. He joins us now. Great man, hardly a surprise, but sadly, it's come true.
Yeah, well, mate, look, would you be surprised? I mean, whatever happens from here on in, and that's the other thing, we've got legislation being spoken about at the moment, and quite sensibly, Dan Tehan and Peter Dutton are saying, well, listen, maybe, we're going to hand it back to the Supreme Court to make a decision here. I mean, let's test it. I mean, Dutton has said repeatedly on my program and again today in Sydney, they didn't have to release these people. They didn't have to release them. I mean, they could have just waited and waited and waited. And don't forget, there were 2 High Court judges who didn't want to announce the decision. 16 minutes after they reserved their judgment, they come back and make it. And 2 of the female judges, headed by Justice Gleeson, she said, well, hang on a sec, maybe we should just delay this and not release these people until, I think interpreting what she was saying, we'll give the government a bit of time, a bit of wriggle room here to come up with something to keep these people in. She knew a pedophile was about to release, she knew a murderer was about to release, she knew sex offenders were about to release, she knew drug dealers were about to release, she knew bikers were about to be released, and there was a bit of nervousness attached to it. So would we be surprised if someone's been charged with offences today? No, we wouldn't be. It would follow their normal method of behaviour, I'd imagine.
Now, let's talk politics more widely. 12 months ago, Prime Minister riding high. 12 months later, he's now at the lowest point he's ever been in the polls. More than half the country saying that they're in financial trouble, in part because of this government. Why has it changed so badly this year?
Well, I think he's deferred to these ministers you've just referred to, Claire O'Neill, Home Affairs, Andrew Giles, Immigration, and of course, Casanova Bowen, the Energy Minister, who was formerly in another government, the Immigration Minister.
Yeah, look, I'm going to stop you there.
What's wrong?
I've heard Casanova Bowen multiple times on radio. Now you're on my show. What the hell does it mean?
Well, it means quite literally and figuratively, there was a bloke many, many moons ago called Casanova, and everything he touched, he and at the moment, that's exactly what this bloke's done in every channel he's been involved in. Immigration, all the boats came in. Now energy is over there in the United Emirates, where they're all saying, look, we need nuclear. Macron said we need nuclear. There are 19 others saying we need nuclear. The USA says it. All of Europe's saying it. So what does Casanova do? He gets over there and says, no, it's wind, it's solar, it's renewables. He's out there on his own. The bloke's a complete moron. He's got 48 bureaucrats with him. 48, imagine the carbon footprint for all of those people. That's without them talking, that's just flying there. Now, Neil Mitchell, my colleague who's retiring, God bless him, on 3AW, he interviewed the Prime Minister and said, are you going to hold these ministers to account who said that he's protecting pedophiles? Peter Dutton, who was a former police officer who was very much involved in the protection of children. He said, no, they can apologise for themselves. I'm not going to apologise on their behalf. Now, what he's done, and he showed this leading into the election, as you well know, he didn't know the answer to any number of questions. He's not across these portfolios. He knows bugger all about Home Affairs. He knows less about immigration and certainly not much about the environment. So he lets these cowboys run right and do whatever they like. And as a result, I mean, you got the lunatics running the asylum. You need a Prime Minister to take control of his ministry and in a controlled, dedicated way say, listen, we're all pulling in the one direction. You can't go off target here. You've got to stay with me. But he lets them run rampant. Calling the opposition leader a decent man, whether you like him or dislike him, he's a decent man, protecting pedophiles. I mean, it's defamatory, highly defamatory.
So where are we a year from now? If he's teetering, but there's many in the gallery who are going to do their best to save him over summer, where do you reckon we'll be in 12 months' time?
Well, I think Bill Shorten might be sharpening things up, because they have a history, historically, of changing PMs after a period of time of a lack of success. He hasn't connected with the electorate. Look, I've known him for decades, through football mainly, because he's a desperate South Sydney supporter. And I thought, well, he's come from this background. He looks like he's doing his best, and he might just give it a red-hot go. He has been a gold medal. In fact, he's gold, silver and bronze on the dais, as far as disappointments are concerned. I mean, he just hasn't taken the position seriously. And as a result, he's lost the news poll. He's lost the more recent poll we spoke about yesterday, published in the Daily Telegraph, where people just say, look, he's not a Prime Minister. He's not leadership material. And I think at some time, we've got this convoluted way now with Labor of how you get rid of Prime Ministers because of what happened previously. But at some stage next year, I think B. Shorten will line up and say, yeah, pass the baton here, old mate, and you better just go back to wherever you came from, because you're not doing the job, and we're going to get beaten at the next election if you keep going the way you're going.
What about the Labor Party with the sort of get Dutton strategy, where it feels like at any occasion turn around, scream, blame Dutton? You mentioned it before, clueless Claire O'Neill and the idiot immigration minister, who were turning around and again making that horrific suggestion that he was a protector of pedophiles. But you know that every chance they get, it's all about how extreme he is, hoping to sort of turn him into the caricature that The Guardian have tried to create. But does any of that work? I mean, I think people have seen Dutton over the year that he's been exactly where the people were on The Voice. He's where the people are on Borders, and he's where common sense was way back even in the Jobs Summit. Remember the early days of this government?
We've said for a long time that if they're to have any hope, they need a right-wing leader. They need someone from the right, to champion for the right. Because, I mean, Malcolm Turnbull could have been a Labor... In fact, he could have been a Green Prime Minister, actually. Yes. And, Scott Morrison was pretty much middle of the line, but if they're to have any hope, they've got to take a position. And the position that's being held by Dutton is appreciated by Middle Australia. I mean, I know the Greens and those of the left will be, hysterical if in fact he became Prime Minister, but the simple fact of the matter is he's a bloke that gets the job done. And, I mean, regardless of what they say, and don't forget Annika Wells was the other one that went on the Today Show with my old mate Carl and called him a protector of pedophiles. I mean, that wasn't in Parliament, that was on a nationally aired TV program. But he's a bloke that gets things done. Now, I speak to him every Thursday and have for the last 4 or 5 years, maybe longer. And I declare that I'm a fan of his. I think he's a good fella. But we've got to have a definition. We have, like in New South Wales, Mark Speakman, he could easily be a Labor Premier. I mean, he's as woke as they come. You need definitive changes. I watched a special last night on pay TV about Winston Churchill. I was almost cheering from the sidelines as I watched his career and leading Great Britain through the war and then being dumped after the war and then being resurrected. And I thought, there's the bloke that stood for something. We don't have a politician really, apart from Dutton, that stands for anything. We have this group of woke people who are too scared to offend anyone. That's why we had The Voice. That's why we had The Voice. And you've got to understand that 60% of the nation voted against it. Only one place in the Commonwealth voted for it. It was in Canberra. Well, I mean, really? Are you surprised at that? I mean, and we don't have anyone except Dutton and some on his right that are with him there that are leading the charge. There's still plenty of woke mob, on that other side. Joyce is another one who speaks out on behalf of the right, and good luck to him, Barnaby. If you had a combination of Barnaby and Dutton leading the charge at the next election, I think they're a red-hot chance of beating Labor, a red-hot chance.
We did such a great job finding things from the Humpty Dumpty Foundation for the people of Mildura that we're going to do it every month with Our Town. Now, Our Town this week is going to be from Port Lincoln, in South Australia, and I need some help. Now, we need to find about $47,000 from the people who watch this program to be able to get a whole bunch of stuff that is going to keep babies alive. Now, I think we can do this. I don't want it to be a scenario where we just had 1 month where this was a great, huge, big idea and then kind of it falls over. And this is where you come in. I know it's difficult. I know cost of living. I know there's always many good causes, but we all know how important this one is to make sure there's equipment in those hospitals forevermore. Those are the details. Please give what you can. See you tomorrow.